Hello and welcome to Literary Notes, a podcast by the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library. I'm your producer, Nathan Ureta. The International District is one of my favorite parts of Seattle. It's a great place for trying out new restaurants, attending fun events year-round, or just taking a walk. And while I was always somewhat aware of its diverse history, today's guest helped me see the neighborhood's past in a new light. Dr. Marie Rose Wong is an associate professor of urban planning and Asian American history and community development at Seattle University. Her book, Building Tradition, Pan-Asian Seattle and Life in the Residential Hotels, details the history of the International District's single-room occupancy hotels, a type of business that was hugely influential in the development of the neighborhood. She was interviewed by library volunteer Camille Blanchette. Here's their conversation.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Camille Blanchette, a volunteer talking book narrator at the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library, and I'm here today with Marie Wong, Professor Emerita of Urban Planning and Asian American History and Community Development in the Institute of Public Service at Seattle University. She has taught at Texas A&M, Iowa State University, Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and the University of Washington. She is a board member of the Gongnyik Community Association, and she is the author of Sweet Cakes, Long Journey, The Chinatowns of Portland, Oregon, and the book we'll talk about today, Building Tradition, Pan-Asian Seattle and Life in the Residential Hotels, published by Chin Music Press. Marie, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for the invitation.
This book is such a valuable history of the Chinatown International District, or CID. In your preface of the book, you vividly describe your first experience of Chinatowns when you were a child. Could you share that with us?
I think at the time when my dad would take one of my brothers, myself, to just to visit the Chinese American communities in the Midwest. There weren't very many of them, nothing that you could consider to be a Chinatown. But when he would take us there, we just kind of looked at it as, work that we had to do and that we would be there for a day or two. And it never occurred to me then where we would be staying, other than the fact that I wanted to stay in a motel because those were new and flashy. But I never thought about the places where we stayed were actually an American building type. As a teenager, you're not really going to care about that. And it wasn't until 1997 when I was helping with a tour that was being conducted as part of a national conference. And we were taking people through the CID. And I started hearing people complaining about, why doesn't the CID look Asian? Where are the upturned eaves? Where's the red and yellow? That's when it occurred to me that people were really missing the point about what we had in the district and what Seattle had. And that's when I was recalling, wait a second, I didn't understand it either when I was a teenager and my dad had us staying in residential hotels. So that was kind of the introduction. I'm going to say the introduction and the realization of what had happened, decades earlier.
So that's when you started researching single-room occupancy hotels, SROs?
Yes. Yeah. That was the beginning. And just standing on the corner, and I think everybody has those aha moments. And you look at something and you'll say, wait a minute, I wonder how many of these there are. What can I learn about this building type? And I still remember we were standing in front of the Panama Hotel at the time. And that's what started me on the journey to try to find the buildings and to look for the people who could tell me about what it was to live in one of these buildings.
Oh, thank goodness you had that aha moment. Your book is so rich with information. It covers the early history of Asians on the West Coast and in Seattle, of Seattle itself, the Chinatown International District, and then an extensive examination of SRO hotels. I was bowled over by your research for the book, which I think took you 14 years.
Yes.
I had a picture in my mind of you sitting in dark basements with forests of shelves of dusty archives, but maybe everything is digitized now.
It's pretty surprising, but everything is not digitized, and in some ways, I'm really grateful for that. But yeah, I sat in a lot of archival facilities. I sat in a lot of dusty places. I met a lot of really incredible people who were willing to talk with me about their buildings and their families.
Mm-hmm.
And I wish that I could do research faster, but unfortunately, I just can't. So,
You mentioned the interviews. You did about 100 interviews, or
Yeah.
more than 100, actually.
yeah.
One wonderful story in the book is your relationship with the Main Street Gang, and I hope you'll tell us about that experience.
You know, as I was going through the district, some of the people I talked to said, "Well, you need to talk to the Main Street Gang," but they couldn't tell me how to get in touch with them. Excuse me. So there was one person who told me, "You need to go to the Panama Hotel." So it was almost like everything kept directing me back to the Panama. And I went into the hotel, and I knew that Jan Johnson she had just recently taken over the building. She had bought it from the Horry family. And I asked the manager of the tea house, could I leave a message here for the Main Street Gang? And they said, sure, go ahead. We'll tape it in the front of the register. They come in periodically, and we'll just make sure that they look at it. So I put the request in. I told them what I was doing, why I wanted to talk with them. And I wrote it on this paper, put it in an envelope, and I put Main Street Gang, please read. And it was a while later that I got a phone call from Roy Hashimoto. And he said, he read the letter. He said, well, yeah, the guys, we get together, we have lunch, we have tea afterwards. And I think the best way of introducing you would be if you and I meet right before they come in. And I'll tell them that you're a friend of mine, and that'll kind of pave the way, and then we can start talking. And that's exactly what happened. And they were fine. They were happy to talk with me about what it was like growing up in the Japanese Quarter. And it started out as research. But when you meet with somebody, we met every month. Typically, we go to the Busch Garden restaurant first. And we met every month for 8 years. So what starts out as research ended up being a really close friendship. And for a very short time, once a month, I could become a Japanese American with the guys. And it was wonderful.
Didn't they also make you an honorary member of the gang?
They did. It took a couple of years, and then they made me an honorary member. They gave me a number 5. There were originally 17 members of the gang, and over the years they had passed away. So when I met them, there were 4 who were left, and they said, "Well, we're going to make you honorary 5." And then they stopped calling me Marie. They stopped calling me Doc Wong, and they said 5, and they'd call me on the phone, and Mr. Hashimoto, he was 4. He'd say, "Hey, 4 or 5, this is 4. We're going to meet for lunch."
How funny.
Yeah.
That's great. I love that story. Seattle's CID grew with a series of waves of immigration from Asian countries. When did those occur?
Well, there's smaller numbers of immigration, but if you're talking about significant numbers of immigration, we followed San Francisco ever so slightly, but you can start to see significant numbers like 1870 for the Chinese, 1890 for the Japanese, and 1920 for Filipino immigration.
And what kinds of employment was available to these immigrants?
A lot of labor. It's interesting because you can kind of follow the labor that as the numbers of the Chinese would decline, then the Japanese would take over the positions. But labor contractors were like employment agents, and they would get contracts from industries like rail industries, canneries, lumber mills, that they would need a certain number of employees. And then it would be up to the labor contractor to find these individuals. And so in the Pacific Northwest, we had all of the aforementioned, but we also had the fishing industry, the canneries, and that's what brought them. Just like any other immigrant, they're looking for a better way of life. They're looking for employment opportunities, and many are looking for a place that they can call home.
Right. You point out that unlike many Chinatowns in the United States, Seattle's CID was an intermingling of nationalities, not separate enclaves, the Japanese section and the Chinese section and so on. And the population was not just Asian.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. South of Yesler Way, we had just an incredibly rich mix of immigration. People from Scandinavia, Italian Americans, German Americans, Asian Americans, African Americans, Native Americans, all living south of Yesler Way. And the one thing that united all of these groups is that they were part of the urban poor.
The majority of the population was single men, correct?
Yes, yeah. And a lot of that is the function of immigration laws. I'm going to say some of it's cultural, some of it's immigration law.
I'm going to want to talk about that in detail in a bit. Of course, Asian immigrants faced discrimination and hostilities through the years, including an anti-Chinese riot in Seattle in 1886. In your words, at no time was the Pan-Asian population ever free from a myriad of regulations. Would you review some of the restrictive laws that were applied to Asians in the U.S.?
Oh my gosh. Some of them were explicit and some of them were implicit. The one thing about building tradition is that I was most interested in how the laws affected property ownership. And property ownership was linked to citizenship. If a group of individuals is prohibited from becoming citizens, and you have to be a citizen to own property, you're immediately out of the economic gain. If you look at how we have marked who is a citizen, it goes back to 1790, when if you were free and white, you could be a citizen. And so it never really says, if you're Asian, an Asian immigrant, you cannot become a citizen. But essentially, that is exactly what happened.
Mm-hmm.
So what starts out as something that is not clearly stated ends up being very clearly stated with the first of a series of Chinese exclusion laws that began in 1882. And that's kind of, I don't want to say that is the beginning, but it is the first piece of immigration law that is directed at a group that is based on their race.
Mm-hmm.
So it starts in 1882, it's expanded in 1884, and this keeps on track until we start addressing Japanese Americans. And then you start to see a series of alien land laws that start in California in 1913. It spreads to a number of states, including Washington State. And then we end up getting on the books in 1921. And it continues with, for the Filipino Americans, the Tidings-McDuffie Act. But all of these combined become part of this mountain of federal legislation. And then, depending on the municipality, you had local legislation that you were trying to rise above. And that kind of brings us to your initial question about the Seattle riots and the Seattle expulsion, that it ends up being a product of local cubic air ordinances that the city had passed that you had to have a little over 500 cubic feet of air per dwelling unit. And because Chinatown is already looked at as a foreign land of people who cannot be assimilated, they start to look at what the living conditions are. And it ends up being a mob of individuals that are going into what it ends up being the second Chinatown. But they're going in there to see how these individuals are living, and they use it as an excuse for their expulsion. So it's a round robin of law.
So Asians could not become naturalized, so they couldn't own property as individuals, but there was a workaround.
There was, and I'm going to have to credit Chun Ching Hock with this. It was just, actually, it was a plan of genius that he incorporates a company, the Hua Chung Company. And it's so interesting because you can have a Chinese name, you can have Chinese board members, but because the entity is the corporation, you license the corporation with the state of Washington, and you can buy property. So he pioneers this, and I believe it was 1869, he pioneers this idea. And it's an idea that's then adopted by Japanese Americans. It extends into Chinatown, and now you're starting to see property that can be purchased and buildings that can be constructed.
And the Watchung was actually the heart of Seattle's first Chinatown. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct.
And do those buildings still stand today?
The three buildings that were part of, and I suppose I should clarify this a little bit, that I call it the second Chinatown.
Mm-hmm.
The first area is actually on Mill Street, and it wasn't really Chinatown. So the first official Chinatown would be at Second and Washington.
Mm-hmm.
The three buildings that were the core of that, the remnants are still standing, but I think very few people would ever recognize them. If you look at a photograph of what those original three buildings looked like, I don't think anybody would recognize them. And part of that is because those three buildings lost part of either their height and or the facades in 1927 when the city made the decision that they were going to build the Second Avenue extension so that there'd be a better connection between the north part of downtown and the train stations.
Mm-hmm. So SROs started to be built, and they really proliferated. There got to be hundreds of them, and they were in response to the majority population of single men, and because they were affordable and quickly constructed, and they covered 100% of their lot, which was economically wonderful. What other advantages did they offer?
Well, anybody could stay in a residential hotel for any amount of time. So if you just wanted to go there for one night, that was fine. If you wanted to end up staying for longer than that, you had the flexibility that you could do so. And it wasn't just for laborers, but anyone who had a lower fixed income, which I'm sad to say teachers also fit into that category, that you could stay in one of the residential hotels. There was so much flexibility because there wasn't any kind of lease. So if, let's say that you're living in an SRO and your room has a bed and a table, but a new SRO is being built across the street, and they have a bed, a table, and maybe a wardrobe, a simple wardrobe, and a sink in the room where you had, cold water that was actually in your room. That would be considered a luxury upgrade. And you, because you have no lease, you could move to the hotel across the street. And now this was done not necessarily according to any kind of code or permission, but you could put a doorway in between two rooms. And so you would have two rooms right next to each other. So there was some flexibility if you had a family that was going to be operating one of the hotels. This was this was a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
So, the flexibility, the affordability of the SROs, their proximity to the trolley lines, street cars, rail stations, made them a really attractive place for people to stay.
Now, social reformers' perception of SROs was it was a bunch of lonely single men in isolation, and that wasn't actually true. They developed their own community. What, how did that work, and what was that like?
Well, yeah, social reformers were afraid of residential hotels. They were basically afraid of any kind of close quarters. And a lot of that comes from the Victorian ideology where, if you were close to other people, that it would somehow be an invitation for moral decay. Um, so, but the residential hotels, I think because of the prescription of what they look like, that you're looking at a building that could be anywhere from 2 to 6 stories, that at grade is always going to have commercial services. So the people who were living in the building, some of the people that I talked to never left their block. They didn't have to, because you had restaurants, barbershops, bathhouses, any kind of sundry, groceries, all available in your building or maybe the building next door. And it enabled the individuals living in these buildings to interact with the community in their building or the community in their block or the community of the neighborhood. So even though the hotels were often characterized as being, the bastions of moral decay,
Mm-hmm.
in so many ways they created the possibility of community. And it was up to the individual. If you wanted to participate, you would. And if you didn't want to, you wouldn't. So it wasn't really any different than what we see in contemporary neighborhoods today.
Mm. You talked about Chun Cheng Hock. Goon Dip was another important figure in the CID and the Gongik Investment Company. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Oh, yeah. When you think about all of the impediments and the roadblocks that they had from being inappropriate to become citizens to not being allowed to have to own property, these men figured out how to do it legally. Goon Dip starts out as a very young immigrant teenager, settled in Portland. He ends up working for Moy Bak Hin, who is with the Chinese consul. And he learned the hotel business through joint ownership of the Oregon Hotel in Portland. Now, he ends up in Seattle and is involved with the same kind of creation of corporate identity. So he and Chun Cheng Hock basically come up with a plan to build a Chinatown that is not going to be relocated and that it's going to be owned by a number of Chinese immigrants and individuals in China, because not all of the shares of the Gongik Investment Company were owned by people living in Seattle. They were people that were literally living in Canada, they were living in the US, and they were living in China. So these men incorporate the Gongik Investment Company. The company has the identity. They have 1,100 shares at $50 a share that they can sell. And the result of which is the construction of the East Gongik and the West Gongik building. The East Gongik is now the Wingluk Asian Museum. But the plan was that they were going to build these two buildings, that it was going to be a home for, we'll say, more permanent immigrants, Chinese immigrants, and that one of the buildings would also be able to house those Chinese who were getting ready to go back to China for visits. So they had this vision of what these buildings were going, what they were going to be. And if you look at Gongik, the loose translation of it is for the mutual benefit. So that was the plan. But it wasn't just a plan for Seattle. They actually envisioned the SRO as being the building type that was going to be one that would be replicated in Chinatowns all across America.
Oh, amazing.
That was the vision. And the buildings are still standing.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a plan that ended up being adopted by other associations, other Chinese associations, like the Bing Kung. They also did their building. Gundip did another building, the Milwaukee, which is catty corner from the West Gongik. And he did it under, I believe it was the Daniel Land Company. And Gundip had a number. He must have had at least a half a dozen different corporations that he was operating that were all under his ownership.
Mm-hmm.
But they sounded, I mean, the Daniel Land Company, actually named after his son. But that's how they did it.
Now, of course, not all the buildings in the CID were owned by Asians. We should probably touch on the Empire of William Chapel and his ownership of property there.
Yeah, until I started working on building tradition, I don't think anybody had ever heard of William Chappell. He just was a name that was under the radar. And when you look at it, he was the single largest property owner in the CID neighborhood. He was, I'm going to say, an unscrupulous businessman. He made his fortune in Alaska. And even the way he made his fortune was a little bit unusual. He had two partners, and they had 3 claims in Alaska. So he was trying to decide, they were trying to decide who gets what claim, and they literally drew straws. And he ended up drawing the straw with the claim that ended up striking it rich. So he came back to Seattle with his money and believed that the financial district of Seattle was going to develop on the south side of the downtown. And that's where he started investing his money. In the meantime, while he waited for the city to somehow build the municipal center there, he started investing in land and building residential hotels that were not exactly used for, how do I put this, the best purpose. He invested in hotels that were going to be used for houses of prostitution. And he made a fortune with it.
The Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition of 1909 was seen as a great opportunity for the Seattle Asian community. And I learned a lot about that. Could you talk about that a bit?
Well, it's kind of interesting when you look at the AYP that that's being constructed, and it's going to have its big launch in 1909, and that's at the same time frame that we're seeing these residential hotels being designed and planned, and construction happening in the CID. So the fact that the Japanese Americans and the Chinese Americans both adopt a plan that kind of satisfies tourist attraction, that they looked at incorporating the upturned eaves and to try to make it look more Asian. But in the district, the Japanese and the Chinese are both completely committed to the design of an SRO. The opportunity, though, for the AYP Expo was to try to get the rest of the city to understand the commitment that they had as being part of Seattle's residents, that they weren't going to leave. I mean, one problem, I think, is that people always look at the Chinese and the Japanese as being, especially the Chinese, as being sojourners, that they would come here, they make a lot of money, they go back to China. But if that were really the case, why did they go to so much effort to figure out how to buy property and construct buildings? So they look at the expo. This is an opportunity for people to understand what Chinese American and Japanese American Seattle are all about. I'm not really sure that was accomplished. And I'm going to say especially for Filipino Americans, because they were treated so abysmally that they end up putting these people on display rather than look at who the individuals for Filipino America really were. Because at the same time that this is happening, they are already having a program to bring Filipino Americans or Filipino immigrants to America to study at American universities. So the dichotomy is just incredible as to how these individuals were displayed.
Truly. It's painful.
It is horrible.
You mentioned Chappelle's houses of sex workers, and the vice issue came up a lot when the CID was being considered because of the gambling and drinking and sex work that did go on there. It was known by various names: the restricted district, the tenderloin, below the line, the red light district, etc. Can you talk about that a bit, and about the evolution of ordinances that were passed to try to control the vice?
Well, it's kind of funny because the city knew that there were all kinds of vices that were taking place. They were afraid to completely outlaw it because they thought if they did, that gambling, houses for sex workers would end up in a different municipality, and then Seattle would lose out on the money that all of these businesses generated. So the restricted district, and it's kind of, I don't know, the restricted district actually was where nothing was restricted. That these were places where if you were going to have a bordello, this was the place that you knew that you could have one. And it's interesting because the monies that they generated, while the greater Seattle was complaining that these businesses should not be there at all. And as we see more people that are traversing the same streets from the CID into the business center of the North Downtown, they wanted these businesses completely eradicated. And the city ends up saying, well, we've got billboards that will block your view. So as you're on the trolley line or on the streetcar, you won't really see them because we're going to have a billboard that is put up there. And then there were the problems with the monies, that these businesses brought in so much money for the people who owned them that the city started looking at this. I'm going to say, in a way, it was a form of taxation. That if you owned one of these businesses, 20% of the money that you took in needed to go to the city. And then from that money, the city would hire extra police that would then monitor the businesses in the restricted district. So this was this round robin of this area where everybody knew what was happening. And it's the same area that they're sharing with the Asian American community. And by this time, you're also seeing more families that are coming in, specifically for Japanese Americans, and they're trying to raise their children. And the children, that was one of the questions that I asked the people that I interviewed, is how did you know that, Gracie's place? How did you know Gracie's place was there? Oh, well, we just knew. Did your parents talk to you about it? Oh, no, they didn't have to. We just knew. Now, I'm still curious as to how children just happen to know what's going on. Excuse me. One of the stories that the Main Street gang told me was that they wanted to peek in the window of one of the bordello houses that was located on Main Street. And so they got two of the guys from the neighborhood. They took their dad's coat and his hat, and the younger brother stood on the shoulders of the older brother, and they put the coat on and the hat, and they went up to one of the houses and they peered in the window. Well, the women who were working in the house, they knew that these were two kids. And one of the things that they did, if you were, I'm going to say advertising the trade, you tap on the window. So they started tapping on the window, and the kids got so scared that the younger boy jumped off the shoulders, that the two of them are running down the street. The coat falls by the wayside, and so does the hat. And the father comes home that night, and he wants to know where his coat and his hat, and they didn't want to confess. So as far as I know, nobody knew that this had occurred. But there were all kinds of stories like that never made the book.
Mm-hmm.
Where they would climb up on the roof of one of the houses, and they would hold one of the boys by the ankles so that they could peer into the windows.
Very funny.
So it was a very active kind of neighborhood.
Yeah. Now, one of the Vice businesses was taxi dancing, and I was amazed to learn that the Seattle taxi dancers formed the Women's Dancing Entertainers Union, and that it was officially affiliated with the American Federation of Labor. I think that's just astounding.
It is astounding. And so little information on that union. Other than what was in the book, there was no other information about membership names, how long the union was in existence. But it was a means of trying to say, look, dancing is a legitimate business. It was another one of these, I'm going to say it was another profession that ended up being looked at askance. That what I think they didn't understand, and that I learned through conversations with the Filipino American community, is that a number of these taxi dancers, they made more money taxi dancing than they did if they worked in a department store or if they worked for a phone company. And a lot of these women were taking care of husbands, children, their own parents. It was a perfectly legitimate profession that somehow or another, Mayor Landis, she hated anything that she looked at as contributing to moral decay. And kind of as a side, every time I go into City Hall and I go to a council meeting that's in the Bertha Landis room, I'm insulted that they named it after this person who was so hard on the community and wanted to see so many of these pastimes closed.
Mm-hmm. It's a shame that there isn't more information about the union, the Women's Dancing Union, because it's such a remarkable piece of history. You talked before about the first and the second Chinatowns. Could you describe how the boundaries of the CID have changed multiple times and the pressures that caused the changes?
Well, the first Chinatown ends up being eradicated because of discussions that are taking place between City Hall and the heads of the rail stations as they look at building a tunnel underneath what they said would probably get rid of the Chinese and Japanese American district. And the tunnel was going to connect everything from Jackson north of the city to Virginia. So the Chinese and the Japanese look at this as, I'm going to say, a piece of fate, that they know that something's going to happen and that they're probably going to end up moving. Now, if they wouldn't have done it voluntarily, they probably would have lost the property under eminent domain. So the Chinese, this is the same time that the Jackson Street regrade is coming up towards completion. And the Chinese look at the property in the area where the CID is now as being an opportunity to build residential hotels, which is exactly what happens. And the Japanese American community that is much larger than what has been reported previously, they look at properties to the east of where they were located in that same Second Washington Corps. So the district kind of makes that shift east and south. And it was something that was kind of predicted in the newspapers, because the newspaper said, well, they're going to have to move. They can't move north because of the business district. They can't move to the west because of changes that are taking place on the waterfront. The only place that they can really go is to the east and to the south of where that first Chinatown was located. And that is what happens. Now, at that point, there was never any kind of firm boundary as to where the Asian American district was. It was something that was just kind of known by the individuals. And anything south of Yesler Way was looked at as kind of the lower class dregs of Seattle society. So we don't really start to see any kind of boundaries for the district until well after the decline of residential hotels starts to take place. And then it becomes, I'm going to say, kind of a patchwork, that the city passes a piece of legislation that is so devastating, and I'm speaking about the Ozark Hotel Ordinance,
Right.
that once that ordinance is passed, and no one believes that it's going to have a devastating effect. They think that these low-income housing units, that the people, they're going to have to leave, but they'll find someplace else to go, that it's not really looked at as being a serious issue. Once they start to realize that this really is a serious issue, and that we run the risk of losing the Asian American community, then they enact an ordinance that puts a boundary around it, the International Special Review District Ordinance. But that doesn't happen until the decay of the district is well underway.
Mm-hmm. The Ozark Hotel fire was an arson fire, and
It was.
I can't remember, did people die in that fire?
There were deaths in that fire. There were injuries in the fire. It was the second worst hotel fire that had occurred in the nation. And because of it, there were a number of lawsuits that were filed against the city, because the people whose lives, or the families of those individuals whose lives were lost or who had been hurt in this fire, they looked at it as the city did not do its responsibility, that they should have been monitoring these buildings, that the fire codes should have been adhered to. And in order to avoid, I'm going to say it was kind of a combination of no more loss of life and we don't want to have any more lawsuits, that they pass an ordinance that unofficially becomes known as the Ozark Hotel Ordinance, that you have 1 year to bring your building up to code. Any kind of fire protection was immediate. Any alterations of the building in support of the ordinance, you had 1 year to do it. Now, if you're running a residential hotel and you're collecting $8, $10 a month in rent, there is no possible way that you are going to be able to come up with $11,000 to replace doors in your hotel. But things like permanently sealing transom windows, installing peepholes in all of the doors, quick release doors. I mean, for the first time ever, residential hotels, the main doorway to access the residential floors, they now had to be locked. They had to be quick release doors for egress.
Mm-hmm.
And this was all on the shoulders of the property owners. They had no money. Now, the city passed the ordinance, but they didn't look at how are we going to help these hotel owners come up with the money that they need in order to bring these buildings up to standard. We're passing the standard, but we're not giving them any kind of financial help. And there wasn't any financial help. Nobody was going to loan money on buildings that were only getting a few dollars a month. And so one by one, there's a cavalcade of closures of these buildings. And the worst thing you can do for a building is to close up the residential portions and just leave them vacant. Then you're inviting all kinds of decay. Pigeons do so much damage, windows that are broken, and the only solution to that is boarding them up. So it was really a massive decline for the district and a tremendous loss of affordable housing.
There are efforts going on now to rebuild and restore the district, but there are blocks to that for a number of reasons. The International Special Review District, the Residential Registration and Inspection Ordinance, Mandatory Housing Affordability Act. So people are having to negotiate all these different regulations and laws. What do you think are the biggest challenges facing the CID today?
I think property retention for those few hotels that are left that are still under Chinese ownership. It's very, very hard to come up with the money that you need in order to restore these hotels. They all need to be retrofitted because the city is looking at the unreinforced masonry ordinance. So if you have a masonry hotel, it just adds to the cost of restoring the building. A number of the buildings have been restored, but fewer and fewer of them are under ownership by the Chinese American associations that initially constructed them. One of the biggest problems, I think, right now is being faced by Little Saigon, because a lot of the buildings that they had that are there, the single-story buildings that are not SROs, are so easily torn down. And if they're replaced by a building that meets contemporary zoning, which was a huge issue in the district, to see the zoning more intense that would allow taller buildings around a very modest historic core. But Little Saigon is, we run the risk of losing all of those businesses that were started by Vietnamese immigrants coming into Seattle. That it's very, very expensive to lease any of the commercial storefronts in any of the buildings that are constructed. Without any kind of historic documentation of the meaning of Little Saigon, it's hard to hold on to that kind of cultural identity that's part of that community.
Would you talk about what you're working on now?
I ended up working with the Gongyak Investment Company at first as kind of a volunteer advisor for any kind of issue that would come up with the International Special Review District Board, and ended up being on the board of Gongyak. For a while I was president of the board. Now I'm the secretary of the board. I'm not sure, but I think that may be more work. I don't know. But we're looking at a way that we can restore the Gongyak West building. It is one of the few buildings in the district that still is under its original owners. It's hard to believe that the building is literally owned by the descendants of those original shareholders that purchased their shares in 1910. So we're looking at ways that we can get the building restored.
Well, thank you for that work. Thank you for your excellent book, Building Tradition, Pan-Asian Seattle, and Life in the Residential Hotels. And thank you for talking with us today.
Thank you so much.
Building Tradition, Pan-Asian Seattle, and Life in the Residential Hotels is currently in process in the studios of the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library. It'll be available as an audiobook with the class ID DBC 19316. We'll let you know in a later episode when it's available to download. If you have any questions or comments about the library, or to see if you qualify for our services, visit WTBBL.org or leave us a voicemail at 206-615-0400 or toll free at 800-542-0866. This episode of Literary Notes is a production of the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library, based in Seattle, Washington. I'm your producer, Nathan Ureta. Thanks for listening.